Hello and welcome to the 17th Annual DisOrient Asian American Film Festival of Oregon. My name is Susan Hirata and I'm the Programming Director for DisOrient. For 17 years, it has been our commitment to advocate for representation, diversity, and inclusion, providing a much-needed platform to uplift the voices and stories of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Today, it's my pleasure to host this conversation with three of our wonderful filmmakers. From Honor Thy Mother, we have director, producer, writer Lucy Ostrander. Lucy Ostrander and her filmmaking partner Don Sellers launched Storewater Pictures in 2002, which has focused on discovering and telling the stories of everyday people who have lived extraordinary and meaningful lives. We also have executive producer and writer Gina Corpuz. Gina Corpuz grew up on Bainbridge Island and is one of the Indopino subjects in the film. Once Gina learned about her mother's story, she was determined to share it and educate others about the hidden history of Bainbridge Island. And last but not least, we have director, writer, producer from Morkovcha, Lidiya Khan. Lidiya Khan is a photographer, filmmaker, and educator based in New York City. She's the fourth generation of ethnic Koreans born and raised in the former Soviet Union. Her projects are influenced by her multicultural and multinational upbringing. Thank you all for taking the time to chat with us today. I have to say, we've seen a lot of films over the years on many different topics, and our screeners were so surprised by both of these films. They are really interesting and fascinating stories that we have never heard before, so it's really great to have you in our program this year. So Gina and Lucy, let's start with you. How did this topic become a project? And is this film really the first time a wider audience is learning about Indopinos? And are there Indopinos from places other than Bainbridge Island? So why don't you tell us a little bit about
that? Gina contacted me in the summer of 2019. She said that she had a small grant and wanted to do some oral histories of the Indopino community. And I had met Gina a number of years ago, and she appeared in a film I produced called Island Roots about the Filipino-American community on Bainbridge Island. And she said that she hoped that perhaps these interviews, these oral histories, could eventually become a film. And so she selected the people to be interviewed, and we filmed the 6 oral histories, and then an Indigenous Peoples Day event and a drum making workshop. And we then put together a promotional piece that could be used for fundraising. And Gina submitted a grant to the Bainbridge Community Fund, which was a nonprofit that funds other nonprofits locally. And one of the members of the Bainbridge Community Fund had gone to school with a number of the Indopinos and was so moved by some of the clips from these oral histories that he was determined to help raise money to make this a film. Mm-hmm. So that's how it began. Gina, maybe you want to add more.
Yeah.
Yes, good morning and mabuhay. I really felt the need to share the history of the 36 Indigenous women who migrated from their own traditional territories to Bainbridge Island and married Filipino farmers. When the city of Bainbridge Island passed the unanimous resolution to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day on what was Columbus Day, I realized that there were so many people who really didn't know that our Filipino American community was really an Indopino community of mixed heritage people. And we have always identified as Filipino American and not Indopino. I really felt that it was time to honor our mothers and recognize them in our community as well.
So is the term Indopino relatively, it came about relatively recently, or did you grow up with that term, identifying with that?
No, actually, there's a couple of different sources of the term Indopino. One is from Fred Cordova, who's one of the founders of the Filipino American Historical Society. And he has written a book called The Forgotten Asian Americans, Filipinos. And he used the term in his book, as well as Andrew Pasqua, who's in the film, when he was in high school, formed an Indopino student club.
Wow, interesting.
And that was in the 60s.
Oh, wow, interesting. Oh, thank you. Okay, and Lidiya, let's turn to you. So you grew up in Kazakhstan, a fourth generation member of the Koryo-Seram community, who are ethnic Koreans who migrated to Far East Russia. Why is this community so little known in the US? Or at least in my area of the US, it's little known. I'd never heard of that before.
Well, I think it's not just in the US, even in some part of Russia, it's not very known. And I have thoughts, don't know if that's exactly the reason, but my grandparents' generation, they were the one who were forced. My grandparents were young kids. And for them, that was painful to remember and talk about. And then it was dangerous to talk about. It was the Soviet Union. Then my parents' generation, this is something they were not, I guess, interested, because they never grew up hearing any stories. It was still fresh. And there's also, kind of a peak of Soviet happy propaganda. So there was never a need to kind of acquire this information. And then my generation, that's where information started to get lost. So even when we had questions, there weren't many people who could answer these questions. And of course, the documents were hidden. But I have to say that amongst us Russian Koreans, there was never a question. There was never hiding of our identity. We still kept traditions, some kept language. So we knew that we were Koreans. We knew just kind of general where we're from. And it was not hidden in, just around us in general. There's just no details.
When did your family move to the United States then?
I moved, it was just me and my mom, actually. When it comes to family. So my family is still there. So I moved here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So moving
So
to
that family gathering was over there. It wasn't in the United States then.
No, it's here. But it's
yeah.
Blood. It's not blood related.
I see.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So moving to the United States, or there's a lot of Russian Koreans that moved to Europe. It wasn't like a mass migration. It was just individual family looking for a better place. And I think we have this in our mind, that's Russians, Kazakhstan, former Soviet Union, still not really a home. So maybe we're still looking for that place to belong. So yeah, I moved in late 2000, and then my mom followed after.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think your film is a wonderful mix of historical information and your conversations with your mother. And what I found interesting was how the Korean migrants formed their separate villages and preserved their language and cultural traditions, yet they also willingly assimilated into the new homeland, and they learned the language and they participated in the larger community there. I was thinking that the bulk of it was probably your like you said, maybe your grandparents' generation doing that assimilating, and yeah, how much you, fourth generation, identify as Koryo Saram community, and how strong is that community still to this day? Yeah.
Yes, and we think in my grandparents generation, it was needed. Assimilation is needed to survive.
Yeah.
And then just the nature of Soviet Union, it was they always try to unite people. We're all one part of big community, of big country that is, and the goal is to create that better future. So it was a like inside community reasons, and there was also the outside of the community forces to assimilate.
Mm-hmm. And so today in that area, is the Koryo Saram community pretty in one place, cohesive, or spread out across area?
Spread out.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
spread out.
Okay.
Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are full of Koryo Saram, and they are part of the country. I don't think that you can clearly separate Korean and Uzbeks, or Korean and Kazakhs now. They're just, through the years, they become a part of the culture of the country.
Yeah, wow, really interesting. Okay, I'm going to switch back to Gina. You and the others in the film talk about feeling like you didn't belong. There was this incongruence between home and school, being shunned by the Filipino community for being First Nation, while the white neighbors discriminated against you for being Asian. And was it seemed like it was actually the taking in of that identity of Indopino that gave you, well, I'm wondering if that gave you all that sense, a sense of more belonging, because you had this community now that had this name and a place where you belonged.
Right. I think it's important to express how we identify ourselves, because most of our lives, up until we were 50, 60 years old, we identified as Filipino American. And while doing that, we were in fact denying the heritage of our indigenous mothers. And some Filipino Americans who belong to our Bimbajalan community felt that it was a betrayal to our fathers to change our identity to Indopino, because my father was one of the founders of the Filipino American community of Bainbridge Island. And he started the Filipino Growers Association in 1935 as a protest. Even then, our fathers were activists. And when they found out that the canneries were paying other farmers more per pound for their berries than Filipinos, they started the Growers Association, and that evolved into the Filipino American community. So how we identify is important in that it legitimizes both our Filipino/Asian orientation and our indigenous orientation. And we were actually forced to acculturate into 3 different cultures. And it was very traumatic and challenging, because I don't think we were very successful in any of those attempts to become mainstream, because we couldn't hide the color of our skin,
Right.
the fact that we were poor, that we didn't go to Europe during summer break, that we had to pick berries, and that our parents, my father spoke Ilocano. So I was raised in a home that was not all English. And we just learned to be quiet because we couldn't understand what our Filipino fathers were talking about. And in particular, in social gatherings, we just learned to ignore and be quiet. And we're not participating in the conversation. Whereas in school, you got a bad grade if you didn't raise your hand and talk all the time. So we were quiet and shy, and were basically penalized for not being talkative enough.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common also in just Asian communities too, kind of the same thing. Yeah. Lucy, what I'm curious about, what's not mentioned in the film is when the war ended, did the Japanese return to their farms, and how did that go with that re-entering onto the island after what, 3 or 4 years or so?
Some Japanese American families were able to return to the island and start their farms again. Others were not. In our earlier film, Island Roots, we tell a story of the Kitamoto family who their farm was taken care of by Felix Narte, Filipino. And when the Kitamoto family returned to the island, they gave Felix Narte some of their property so he could start his own farm. So,
and so is that still are there still I think there still are a lot of farms, strawberry farms or farms in general on Bainbridge Island, and are they descendants?
Not as many as there used to be.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna put out this last question to all of you, and I'll specify it a little bit. So Lidiya, you were fascinated as a child with your family photo album, right? And I found it so moving and effective to watch your film and see the photos being retouched and refurbished. It's like you're bringing your history forward into the present and being seen more clearly, and maybe even being healed. It has that feeling of watching these photos getting retouched. And I'm wondering if that's what it felt like to make this film, you know, in relative to your whole, your community's history and your family's history. So I'll let you answer that. And then Gina, I wanted you to speak to, through this film, you were committed to telling the stories of the Indopinos, and specifically the stories and struggles and resilience of the First Nations mothers. And so for you too, what has been the effect of making this film, the effect on you and on your community? And then Lucy, as a filmmaker, what does it feel like to tell the extraordinary stories of everyday people, which is what you've done with this film? So go ahead, why don't whoever can start with that?
I can start.
Yeah.
Yes, so the restoration, healing, like all those words they use, absolutely. This is all, there were emotions that while making this film, you know, I was researching my own history, my own family history, and there's so little I could find, just really pieces, bits and pieces, and just memories, my mother's memories of some, you know, stories being mentioned. And I just didn't want it to be forgotten, the future generation. And then when someone else, maybe 20 years, decide to research or make another project, there will be another resource that they can, turn to. So that's really the contribution to that, the larger societal archive. And also, Cynthia Gina was saying that the as kids they were really quiet, when they would go out, right, in the outside of their homes. I feel that was my grandmother's life, but not just as a child, but throughout her life. She's very quiet woman. She didn't like to talk about her childhood. But from the little information that we have, she has really interesting life in Far East. And that's also my way to giving her a voice and just, just a little bit for me.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. Gina, how about you?
Yes, and it is a social and political and cultural reality that our lives and our communities have been shaped by legislation of discrimination in both the United States and Canada. My father's country, the Philippines, was invaded by many other countries. And my mother's territory was invaded, of course, by Britain. And there was the Indian Act that legislated that all Aboriginal children, starting at age 5, were to be removed from their communities and put in boarding schools run by Catholics and the Anglican Church. And it was a strategic act to kill the Indian, but save the child.
Yeah.
And of course, it was an attempt to diminish these communities, all these First Nation communities, and continue to take all their resources. And by diminishing their cultures and their traditions and their religious practices and their ability to retain their healthy way of life by introducing alcohol to these communities, it weakened these communities and their ability to sustain themselves. And this was all because of legislated acts of discrimination. And our mothers, released at age 15, moved to the States into a basically quote unquote Asian community where once again their heritage and culture was oppressed and suppressed. And those that survived were amazingly resilient at 15 years old and raising all those children. Out of 36 marriages, over 150 children were born. And we do still have a strong Filipino-American community and have recently started our own nonprofit, the Indopino community of Bainbridge Island. And our main purpose is educational and to develop resources, including film, for schools, museums, and libraries.
Wow, thanks so much for that. Well said and well put. Thank you. Lucy, how about you?
In terms of being able to make these films, it's an honor to learn these stories, meet the people who are the subjects of our films, and get their stories told into a much broader audience.
Great, thanks. We really appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you.
And we have not even talked about Morkovcha, which is the name of your film, Lidiya. We haven't talked about the recipe and the food. And of course, food goes with every immigrant community, right? Every community brings their food along with them. So do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, that is very unique specifically to Russian Koreans. That does not exist in Korea. And it's just a really perfect metaphor for our identity when it's Russian and Korean in making and ingredients and seasoning, and in name itself, when the Morkov is Russian for carrots, and cha is a phonetic variation of salad in Korean. So it's very unique and very popular, and there's stores to sell it in the United States. I'm not sure about
With,
Oregon. Yeah, but
with
in New
that
York
name.
a lot.
Oh,
Morkovcha.
wow.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
wow.
And it's a very
Wow.
it looks distinct look. You can recognize it.
Uh-huh. Wow. Nice. Thanks. Gina, is there a food that bridges the two cultures of your community?
When we have our Indopino celebrations, our Filipino food is available as well as our indigenous foods. So we have lumpia, adobo, and then we have fry bread and salmon.
Uh-huh.
And the communities are really accustomed to that.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time again today to have this conversation. We are thrilled to have your films in our program. And yeah, we wish you all well and best of luck for your films in getting screened all over outside of our program too. So yeah, thank you so much.